exploring concepts of greater equity and broadening of inclusion in the field and the practice of land economics. And I'd like to thank Richard Wilson for the fabulous title for our year 2018, Bridging the Hope Gap. The United Nations defines community development as the process where community members come together to take collective action and generate solutions to common problems. It's a broad term given to practice of civic leaders, activists, involved citizens, and professionals to improve various aspects of communities, typically aiming to build stronger and more resilient local communities. Community developers must understand both how to work with individuals and how to affect communities' positions within a larger social institution. So in thinking about this, I had one person in mind right from the get-go, and then I was reflecting on things that I had been doing over the past year, and I had to give a special shout out to Josh Ellis from NPC, because last year I was on the walking tour that NPC organised in the Pullman Historic District, and that was where I met David Doig. And I was excited, thinking I'm such a social connector, like introduce Reverend Hatch and David, that'd be great. And we got on the preparation phone call, and I didn't even have a chance to say, I'd like to introduce them. Like calling each other nicknames, and they've known each other for 30 years and have traveled to Africa together. So I felt like quite the outsider. So many of you probably know David Doig. He is, I would like to point out, a lapsed Lambda Alpha member. So, bar the doors, he's got his checkbook with him. CNI was formed in 2010 to coordinate resources, economic development, and neighborhood revitalization efforts in Chicagoland's low to moderate income neighborhoods. CNI seeks to revitalize neighborhoods and create jobs by creating high-impact projects, providing financial resources to entrepreneurs, and sustaining long-term community partnerships. So basically all of our taglines of Bridging the Hope Gap. For 25 years, David has served neighborhoods throughout Chicago in various non-for-profit and governmental capacities, including as a community organizer in North Lawndale and as superintendent of Chicago Park District. At CNI, David focuses on strategy and raising capital and helped to lead an organizing efforts to have the Pullman declared a national monument. David has an undergraduate degree from Wheaton College and a master in social science from the University of Chicago. Pastor Marshall Hatch is the senior pastor at New Mount Pilgrim Missionary Baptist Church, located in West Garfield. In 1998, he was appointed the Merrill Fellow at the Harvard Divinity School, a recipient of multiple awards and teaching appointments at institutions including the University of Chicago, Tufts University, Bates College, and Northern Baptist Seminary. Throughout his ministry, Marshall has commenced numerous community outreach programs. Most notably among these are the West Side Isaiah Plan, Ezra Homes, and Pilgrim Village Homes on Washington Boulevard, where 200 single-family homes were built. And the thing that I am personally involved with is an arts community project, and I didn't have a chance to introduce one of our other guests, Marshall Jr., who is the CEO and co-founder of the Ma'afa Redemption Project, which is one of the things that we'll touch on during our talk. So I shall come and sit next to them, and we'll get cracking. Okay. So I did want to just kind of touch on how, and for you, Marshall, you actually live in the community that you serve, but how you came to it and how you feel that your broader experience professionally and personally has led you into community development.
Want me to begin? Thank you, Lindsay. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, my personal story, of course, is that this is a lifelong work and dream that I had. I was a graduate student at Georgetown University in '81, and thinking about the west side of Chicago, where I'd grown up in public housing. And so my call to ministry really was to come back home and do exactly what I'm doing now. So it's been quite the journey. We've developed at New Mount Pilgrim Church and Pilgrim Development Corporation, sort of based right in West Garfield Park. which can be a tough and gritty neighborhood, but I found it to be most advantageous that I can kind of almost approach it because of the breadth of experience and relationships in a way that it is quite pleasant to a person like me to live in West Garfield Park and do the work that we're doing. So it's that sense of having a broader set of relationships. Part of our gift to that community is that it is much less isolated because of the kind of institutions that we've been able to develop.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say it's a real honor and pleasure to be on a panel with Pastor Hatch. Our paths first crossed probably 30 plus years ago when I was working
in elementary school.
We were both in elementary school, right? When I was working in Lawndale, and Pastor Hatch had organized a group of churches in North Lawndale, and it started what was then called the Nehemiah Project, and that ultimately kind of morphed into the New Homes for Chicago program, and worked together on that. And then we were neighbors for about 20 years. We lived about a block apart from each other on the west side. We were reflecting on this. My kids grew up, moved out of the house, and so we sold the big old house and moved to the South Loop. He wants to. He's just, he's so committed to the community. He would, but it was a real honor to be working with Reverend Hatch on the west side for many years. So, I think for me, what has been kind of interesting to watch over the course of the last 30 years is how many of the issues that we're confronting today, they're very much the same as we were confronting 20, 30, 40 years ago. And while there have been, I think, improvements in many areas and in many areas of the city, there remain areas of the city that are still very isolated, probably even more isolated in some ways than they were 20 and 30 years ago. And what has really, I think, moved that, and I think we'll talk about this, is this growing disparity, this growing kind of equity gap between the haves and the have-nots, between those that live in areas of prosperity, growth, and improvement, and then those that don't, that live in areas where there's deficits and unfortunately disinvestment and in many cases even abandonment. So those are some kind of early reflections, right, but I think touch on some of the things that I've witnessed.
So one of the things that we wanted David to kind of share with everyone was the work at Pullman, where you took kind of blended traditional, non-traditional funding sources, and how the flow of capital allowed some of these projects to happen, and maybe programs that you'd like to highlight and maybe have people recommit to.
Yeah, so I'll give you a quick history. Many of you know this. So we actually, Chicago Neighborhoods Initiatives was started about 20 years ago when we were part of Park National Bank. So some of you may remember Park National, local bank, headquartered in Oak Park, owned by a guy named Mike Kelly. And Mike, when he bought what was then the old Pullman Bank, decided he wanted to get more active and involved in community development, and so created Park Bank Initiatives. And so for about the first 7 or 8 years, we functioned as Park Bank Initiatives. We were a subsidiary of Park National Bank. Our capital came from Park National Bank, and most of our work was around affordable housing. So in Englewood, we partnered with St. Bernard Hospital. We built about 100 homes there. In Roseland, we worked with NHS, Neighborhood Housing Services, and built 40 or 50 homes there. I joined Park Bank Initiatives in 2007, and we purchased the old Ryerson Steel site, the 200 acres that we've been redeveloping. As fate would have it, Mike made the unfortunate decision of putting a lot of bank capital in Fannie and Freddie in 2007 and 2008. That ultimately led to the bank being undercapitalized, and we, in 2009, were acquired by US Bank. So we thought that was kind of the end of the road. You kind of went from this local, very philanthropic, very invested in community led bank to now this multi-state, national, publicly owned bank. This is a huge shout out to US Bank. I gotta say the opposite has been the case. US Bank has been an unbelievable partner. They have done things that I would challenge other banks to do. Most notably, they have been our landowner. So when they bought Park National, they basically got the 200 acres. I don't think they had any idea what they were getting, but to their credit, they were supportive, they were cooperative, and they've let us kind of develop this over time. And we've worked on many kind of transactions where we've gotten the land discounted from them, and they've provided both debt, equity, land grants. In addition, when they purchased us, they basically donated our balance sheet to us. So they allowed us to basically be capitalized through that initial donation. That's given us kind of the operating resources we've needed now to function over the last 8-9 years. All in at Pullman.
Sorry, is that something where, was there, I don't know, where is U.S. Bank headquartered?
Yeah, U.S. Bank's headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
So there wasn't any of that kind of personal leverage that you were
purely... I think part of it, this has never kind of been fully confirmed, but part of this was a very high-profile acquisition. You went from this local, wonderful kind of bank that was making investments in communities to this large national bank, and I think because of the attention around that, I think there was some pressure on them, both from kind of the civic leadership in Chicago, but also from the FDIC to do the right thing.
I was around at that time, and high profile is an understatement almost. I mean, we had made this acquisition by I think at that time, the 4th largest bank in the country to Park National. Almost a poster story of what it feels like to be in communities, really detached from capital because of the relationship we had with Park National Bank, and now U.S. Bank will come in. And so we organized from West Side to Oak Park, River Forest, Maywood, citizens. We had people in Oak Park declaring that they were West Siders, because we were all feeling as if we had lost something personal. And so we eventually had a hearing in Congress on this acquisition. And we found out that hearing means we heard you. And now, it still goes forward. So it was a very interesting time, and they did step up to the plate. At that time, I was on the board of Christ the King Jesuit College Prep, which was a brand new $30 million campus, the first Jesuit high school built in Austin in 85 years. And we had a lot of outstanding business that was hanging, and U.S. Bank did step up to the plate on that as well. I mean, we think it had a little something to do with our agitation, but they did become very, very substantial community partners, and the debt of that was cleared up. And the high school now is graduating, I think it's 5th or 6th graduating class, and so the culture of rigor is being built there, and it's a great asset for the community. But it was an interesting story at the time.
Yeah, we talk about tree shakers and applesauce makers. So Reverend Hatch is the tree shaker. I'm the applesauce maker. So we make.
I want a little of that sauce.
You want a little sauce? Yeah. So maybe just to kind of bring kind of the full circle here. So we've invested almost $300 million in Pullman, and probably a quarter of that has been capital that U.S. Bank has provided, either through direct equity investments, new market tax credits. We've used another probably $30 million. 10% of that has been TIF from the city of Chicago. We've gotten very proficient and good at working with TIF. And then we've had just a lot of private investment from our various partners, whether it was Walmart or Method. We just opened the Whole Foods Distribution Center last month. So there's been a lot of capital that we've been able to kind of put through, and then ultimately create jobs. So that's, you mentioned this in kind of who we are, what our mission is, and fundamental to what Chicago Neighborhood Initiatives does is create jobs. And so we've created a little over 1,200 new jobs in the last 5-6 years, and we're now starting to actually see, like, well, what difference does that make? And MPC has been working with us on kind of an impact study, and we are seeing that, in fact, crime is down, unemployment's down, property values are up. We've seen levels of education increase. So there's, I think, we're starting to see signs of improvement.
Which is the perfect segue to my next question, was that if we, physical development and sourcing of the money is, could be seen as a primary driver of development, but I think that if we agree that human capital is equally, if not more important, Pastor Hatch, can you speak to the efforts of empowering individuals and how you create and expand people's skill set within a community to benefit both them and the wider population?
Absolutely. I want to say, first of all, nobody does better, I don't know anywhere in the country, than Dave does with community development. Awesome work. I'm proud to call him friend. I think just getting started with really broadening out the impact of the work that he's doing there. He's done an incredible job in Roseland. Part of what we've tried to do with the project we call Bond for Redemption, and my son is that he allows me to be the front man, but he's the one who really has made it happen as the executive director. We started out working with guys in the Friday and Saturday basketball program over the years, and eventually we had a long-standing relationship with Arnie Duncan. He went away to be U.S. Secretary of Education and then came back to really tackle the issue of violence, and some of it also worked with young men in particular, and a real interest in what were called young men 18, 24 years old, at risk for either perpetrating or being a victim of gun violence. And so the program that emerged out of our shop is the only residential program out of the sites that they have funded. And so we had our first cohort last year. It's a 6-month project. The science behind it was in a neighborhood like ours in West Garfield Park, a lot of open air drug activity. West Garfield Park probably is a regional, unfortunate magnet for open air drug sales, where you see people coming in from all over the region in West Garfield Park. And so, but all of the hardship that comes along with that is, of course, concentrated in the neighborhood, and these young people grow up in that environment. So, we were working with guys already. We had some entrees into the kind of young men that they were interested in talking to and being involved in a project like ours. The science behind it was, the magic number was, what does it take to pull a guy off the corner in West Garfield Park in terms of the number? Everybody wants a job. How much do you need to make? And it turned out the magic number was $12 an hour. We said, well, we'll pay you $12.50. And so we started out with it as the job program that it is, and of course designed in a 6-month process to transition them into a place where they begin to reimagine what their life options could be, and have a life plan. And we were on a residential site, so we had the first cohort of 12 guys living in the house on our campus. So what we found to be most interesting, I really never did believe, and I certainly don't believe now, people just need a job. So it was the social, emotional development around it. And I was very interested in your term today, land economics, because if I was to say the money got their attention, and the job, we had hard work for them, but we put alongside it almost what we call a graduate school course, believing that they could understand this is how your context developed in which you grew up in. And so that was the history of Great Migration, that was the history of what are the economic and ethnic economic dynamics of Chicago. How do you end up in West Garfield Park in this condition? And, once you understand it, the guy standing on the corner, do you want to be that kind of sucker? I mean, so we found that to have been very effective, that people could understand, these guys can understand it, and that in fact there was genius walking up and down the community that maybe we didn't even recognize until we had gotten their attention. I think it was very interesting. Politico came in the community and did a little article on our project, and that day they interviewed our guys. What was very interesting is I watched 18 to 24-year-olds normally would look very hardened, respond very differently with a regular income, the security of housing, because we found out a lot of them were semi-homeless, and we had the faith community, how about a little love, you know, and multi-generations of folk who care about you. I watched them begin to transition into rather normal 18 and 24-year-olds emotionally, with all the vulnerabilities that would express. And so the day we had the political a reporter kind of walk in the neighborhood with us, talked to our guys, they were pleasant, they were, you know, I mean, trying to make a good showing for themselves and for the project. They were polite, hospitable, and then right down the street were the guys who were on the corner, right in front of another building that we own down the street. And it was if you looked in their direction, they would shoot you if you take a picture of them. And I called it the tale of two corners on the same block. And what made the difference was this kind of care and investment in the lives of these young men, but they were exactly the same other than that, and so it's very interesting. We start with 2 cohorts this year, and so we've got another building, and we're gonna have a 16 this time, and kind of still see the things that we can learn from them.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting to me. I think there's sort of obviously you can sort of unpack this topic in a multiple way, but it seems to me that there's kind of the institutional approach where you say you have a bank investment and you have 200 acres and we can have an impact this way. Then you can do it by the incremental change of we're going to renovate this one house and then we're going to cluster 2 or 3 houses together, and you can do it corner store by corner store or house by house, individual by individual.
And try to build people as a part of community development as well.
And then, but all of that kind of, if there's no living wage component to that, then you're kind of stuck, where people are then, you know, they don't have any sense of future and possibility. And obviously bringing in Pullman, bringing in these big method factory or Walmart, those were big decisions that you made. And, you know, David, if I can just kind of throw it out to you to kind of speak to both the positives and the blowback that you got with the big box retail. And
Yeah. I think you know, when we first started in 2010, 2011, we were still kind of in the middle of this recession, and after we got our plan done and we kind of started to move this forward, you know, we went to every retailer you can think of, and Walmart was not our first choice. But they happened to be in a position where they were expanding. They wanted to get into American cities. They had kind of saturated basically the rest of America. And so, you know, we worked with the community. It was kind of ironic because here we are working in Pullman, which is in many ways the birthplace of the union movement in America. And here we are bringing, you know, the union's biggest target. But it was the right time, it was the right thing to do, and in addition to the jobs, you know, 400 jobs is what they brought. It also provided access to fresh groceries and other kinds of products. So that was important. I think what we learned from that is you need to have those kind of entry-level jobs. If you look at kind of this disparity and you know, the isolation that many people feel in low-income communities, a lot of it is because they don't have access to employment, and the jobs that were there 30, 40 years ago are gone. And so where does a young person growing up in Roseland, where do they go? Where do you get your first job? There's not a huge amount of retail or service opportunities available. And so, what Walmart did is it created that kind of first rung of the ladder. So we have lots and lots of young people that get jobs at Walmart and then go on to work. We've worked this kind of job ladder now with Method, so they can work for Walmart for a few years and then move on to a higher paying job at Method. We've even had some that have now gone on and are working at the Ford plant on Torrance Avenue. And so, you have to build these ladders. You have to build rungs that provide those kind of opportunities for people. I mean, many of us, I'm sure our first job was working at a fast food place, and not that you ever want to that's the end all, but you have to have those kind of entry points. So I think that's an important lesson. The other thing we're finding is you can get a job. We can use enough kind of persuasion and enough kind of encouragement that we can generally get employers to take a chance on somebody. It's keeping the job. It's keeping the job that's harder, and this is what is in many ways more frustrating and more intractable. You're going good for a week, 2 weeks, and then your kid gets sick, and so where do you have the child care, or your car breaks down, you can't get there, and so there's all these things in people's lives that end up becoming barriers to kind of keeping the job, and we've seen this over and over again where you get a job and then you're on for a month or 2 months and something happens and then you lose it. And so that is to Pastor Hatch's point. That's why it's so important to have these other wraparound services, to have those support networks, whether it's through churches or through extended family or other social networks, to be able to support people so that they really are able to kind of keep those jobs. I think it's not something that a lot of the policymakers want to talk. Everyone wants to talk about, well, we just need to create jobs. Yeah, okay, that's fine, but it's the kind of keeping the job that's more important.
Sure.
Yeah, because human beings are altogether more complicated than just the economic need. One of the interesting things with the project that Marshall ran in order to reorient, we had the young men living in the residence Sunday night through Thursday, through Friday, they end the workday, so they were kind of furloughed on the weekend, and we found it advantageous to make payday on Monday. So we not only got to work on time on the work days because we lived in the house, we also came back to work because the first day was payday. So, but it's that kind of, I think, community building. I think what faith communities offer that programs can't offer is that the community is always there. Now, we weren't proselytizing, but out of the 12, 6 of the young men were baptized. I think a lot of it had to do with the environment in which they lived was so wholesome. We started doing basketball on Sunday afternoons so they could come back a little earlier from their furlough. And then lo and behold, some of them started showing up in church. I guess they figured, why wait till Sunday afternoon? We could wander into church and meet the same people. But I think one of the things that's been interesting is their 6 months time was up with that, and the goal was that they would either be in school or working, whatever their life plan was taking them that they brought together. But the relationship is ongoing, because the one thing about a faith community, in these communities, they're always there. I mean, we were there before the funder came along, and we'll be there, and when the funder's gone, and so the relationships that they have access to during the program, they just become ongoing, and I think that that's really very important. So we don't really call it a program, it's more of a project for them personally but we're there before and after they have that experience, so that's very helpful.
So we always try to kind of give a takeaway for our audience in a sense of, what they have as their homework in their professional life. If there were two things that you could say that people in the field of land economics should be doing or should have a view to in order that we can make this sustainable and replicable, what do you think would be the most important thing for either our civic leaders or our developers in the audience and our lawyers in the audience?
I'll start. Understanding I'm addressing a room of real estate professionals, I would say, this is, I'm not saying this to be provocative or controversial, but
we love provocation.
I think the biggest challenge that nobody's talking about, not nobody's, very few people are talking about in our city is the issue of depopulation and the out-migration of African Americans in particular. It's gotten some coverage, but this has been happening for 10 years, and it's not stopping. At least we're not seeing it stop. And this is adding to the level of despair and frustration in communities, because if you don't have a community, this is basic economics, right? If you don't have a community that's growing, it's hard to talk about bringing new retail or bringing new housing or bringing other assets to the community when clearly the community is declining. And so I would just challenge all of us to think of ways that we can rebuild and repopulate our neighborhoods. It's wonderful what's happening in many areas of the city. It's unbelievable in many ways. We've got 60 construction cranes. We have more construction cranes than any city in America. But only one of them is south of 22nd Street. And that's in Hyde Park. We've got to find ways to repopulate areas, not in a way that gentrifies or that displaces people, but and I have this argument with some of the affordable housing people to see kind of gentrification happen in places like Roseland or Englewood or even Lawndale. You'd have to bring in 40,000 people. That'd be just to fill back up the land that was once built on. So I get a little discouraged whenever you want to make this an issue of gentrification or displacement. But that's my challenge.
Well, you brought it up, and so did Chris Kennedy. And it's the reality that we've faced in these communities. People are leaving. It's heartbreaking to be in a place like West Garfield Park, where the narrative is, I'm getting out of Chicago. It's horrible. And we're on Washington Boulevard, and maybe 20 plus blocks down the street, the international headquarters of McDonald's is moving in. So, there's the sense of disorientation in Black Chicago is profound. People don't want to talk about race, but it's the subtext of American history. And Black Chicago is reeling. It's reeling. To watch a once proud community like Chatham become depopulated and disoriented and discombobulated and dysfunctional lets you know that it's not just simply the people. It means something systemic is happening, something broad, and to a lot of people on the ground, it feels intentional. Chris Kennedy is somebody that I've known. I wouldn't call him good at politics. I would call him good at truth telling. A lot of it feels intentional. And so the reason why it's not good for any of us is that all of us need to know violence is not going to be contained. When people are desperate, as we can see, there becomes a spill out safe. And it's just the old adage, really, nobody's safe unless all of us are safe. So I think the challenges will be, I think, you know, Dave brought it up, we probably need to have some kind of intentionality about investment in these communities and in the people. You know, what we found out, I mean, these are guys that you would normally throw away. I mean, they've got the dreads and the sagging pants. But when you get to know them, you find the genius that is really there. And that really, ultimately, everybody deserves a chance. And we're not entirely clear on how much talent we're really losing because we've dismissed people and deemed that they were unsalvageable. So we call ours Ma'afa Redemption Project, just as a way to take the gospel out in the public square, that everybody has a right to the tree of life. Amen.
All right, now who would like to ask a question after all that eloquent? Josh, can you project? Or?
Yeah, I can project. Dave, I think a lot of your success in Pullman the last couple of years has made, for a lot of folks, a very, CNI and Pullman are like the same thing now in a lot of folks' minds. But I know more and more of your efforts are starting to be in other parts of the city. You're part of the Michael Reese project and some other things. So what lessons, to what extent is the success in Pullman able to be replicated elsewhere? Or is Pullman central to the success of what you've had? What lessons can you take out of it?
Yeah, so we live in Pullman, we work in Pullman, we office there. Pullman will continue to be the center of what we do, and we have much more work to do in Pullman, and want to see that now expand further west into Roseland. So there's many more years of work to do there. I think a few of the lessons that we've learned from Pullman that we want to be able to kind of apply other places is the importance of really starting with community planning. And you know, I didn't mention this, but when we purchased the old Ryerson Steel site, we didn't have a plan. I mean, we were fortunate to have a bank that was kind of willing to take a chance and buy something kind of speculatively, but we took a whole year and basically we did 70 plus community meetings. We took input from every block club, church group, community organization, and just listened and said, what does the community want? What are the issues that the community has? And that really shaped our development plan. At that time, it was about access to food. We were a food desert. It was access to jobs. It was the need for recreational space, and it was the need for affordable housing. And so those became kind of the kind of foundations and guiding principles that we organized our. We have great schools. Schools were not an issue. We had Poe Elementary, which is one of the top 5 public elementary schools. We have Wendell Brooks, which is a great high school. So schools were not that critical of an issue. But so that we use that to kind of frame. So kind of taking that same logic and applying it in areas where we are starting to get involved, like you mentioned, the Michael Reese site in Bronzeville. We're starting to engage. Actually, we have a large community meeting tonight. If any of you are around, we're starting our planning for the Michael Reese site. So we want to be able to take that kind of planning lesson. I do think we've learned some of the financial tools and how to execute on financing. We can apply that. So there are things that we've learned that, and there's mistakes we've made. I mean, right now we're in the middle of a little fight with some of the folks in Pullman around artist housing project. You may have read about it in the paper. And it's frustrating, but it also suggests maybe we didn't do enough kind of groundwork when we started this, and maybe we didn't really kind of engage the community enough. So I think those are things that we can learn.
As a follow-up on Pullman, David, knowing all the good things that are going on, when I saw the Tribune headline the other day, I was more than a little surprised, and I think they were trying to make a story out of the federal response on but your reaction and how you deal with that kind of
Yeah,
headline.
you know, the headline was worse than the article, which is typical, but no, I think I think there is some truth to the article. You know, it's been 3 years since the president designated Pullman. What do we have to show for it? And part of it is it takes time, particularly when you're working with the federal government, as we are with the National Park Service. Nothing, and Richard's our lead planner on this, and he can speak to this better than anybody. But it takes time to work through federal procurement and you know, even simple things like hiring and all these things take time. So I'm not saying that's an excuse, but it's the reality of what we're working with. Again, I'll say, maybe this is controversial, but I say probably our biggest challenge has been working with the state. And, you know, yeah, you know, the state is a large landowner here. They own the Hotel Florence. They own much of the site where the National Park Service is, and we have gotten no cooperation, help, coordination from the state of Illinois. There has been a void of leadership at that level that has definitely set us back and has made it frustrating to try to move things forward. So I think the article was probably a little overstated. I think they were trying to kind of stir things up, but there's also an element of truth that I think we have to acknowledge.
You answered all your burning questions.
I have a burning question for both of you. So do you have some particular ideas on what we could do to welcome back African American families to the city? I'd really love to hear both of your ideas.
I want to hear what Dave has to say.
You gotta start with it, you gotta take it.
Well, I mean, one of the things that is very, very frustrating is when we look for solutions that don't involve money, capital. And so, you know, we have to start, I think, with some very intentional investments. A few years ago, 50 schools closed in these neighborhoods. I'm in West Garfield Park. We lost 5 schools. Who wants a house next to a boarded up school building? Good luck selling that one at the top price. I mean, so that was a massive and major disinvestment in these communities. And so what you're talking about, ultimately, I think, is intentional capital development. Now, there's some places, of course, the whole food project down near Kennedy King School. I think there's a Mariano's in Bronzeville. I mean, we know what intentional investment looks like. And it needs to be investment, of course, that has a way of also benefiting people who already live there. And that has to be intentional. So I just think some intentionality is a good start point. I think ultimately we know we're talking about capital or about money. And so when we talk about development and we talk about money, it's really spreading it out as opposed to being concentrated in downtown and communities that are already thriving. You know, to be very intentional about the sense of one city. I think that's just a good starting place. You know, housing, in our community, we're looking at doing another housing piece, perhaps working with a high quality elementary school for the area, and then a revitalization on Madison Street between about Hamlin and going west to maybe Kilpatrick, what does revitalizing the West Garfield Chamber of Commerce looking like? So you're talking about commerce, school, and housing, and being very intentional about it.
Yeah, just to build on that, I would say I do think it starts with housing. That you've got to find attractive. I think in many neighborhoods, home ownership options for people. We have not really had a new construction home ownership program in our neighborhoods in probably 10 years, probably since the recession. I mean, we had the New Homes for Chicago program back in the late 90s, early 2000s. That was successful in getting families to come back to neighborhoods. And so, again, this may be controversial, but I would love to challenge downtown developers who are building these wonderful high-rises and both apartments and condos to actually use what is allowed under the affordable housing ordinance and actually build in lieu of paying fees. Fees are fine. I'm sure the city loves fees, the opt-out fees. But what would be more impactful is if you took those resources and actually used them to build housing in neighborhoods where that new construction and that affordable housing is needed. I think the city just raised the ARO fee for opting out downtown on for sale projects to $225,000. We could build a wonderful house for $225,000 in Englewood or Lawndale. I just wish that developers would consider that. We're happy to help them. We're happy to partner with them. We can be their liaison to the community. We can help find the land. But I think to Pastor Hatch's points, that's where you need that intentional, deliberate, focused attention.
I'd like to piggyback on, I have a question for myself, that it's interesting to me. I think the intent of the ordinance is to create more mixed income opportunities. And so the intent is you don't pay the fee, you don't build elsewhere, you actually create mixed income. So it's interesting to hear you say, I would rather have, just give me the cash and I'll.
Well, I would say, you have to think about building a $225,000 house in Lawndale or Englewood is going to bring middle income people to a neighborhood that needs middle income. So we often think of mixed income only as bringing low income and moderate income people to high income neighborhoods. We need to reverse that and start to think about bringing middle income and families and working people to neighborhoods where that's the larger issue.
So, my question changed about 4 times during the course. But it actually, that topic ended up boiling down. As a developer, we're constantly battling the political system. Our zoning codes, our aldermen, forget about neighborhood groups. They're almost easy compared to actually implementing solutions in our political system, which is fighting for integration downtown and is really against taking that money and putting it somewhere else, even if it's within your same ward, which stretches 18 miles, along the So, on one of our projects, we've gotten lucky in Pilsen. We had the zoning, and we bought the buildings from developers who were trying to change it to residential, to do commercial and bring jobs there. And we've been able to work within the community groups and address the long-standing issues of gentrification, although there are many who believe even bringing jobs to Pilsen is fostering gentrification. But how do you work within, if you don't get lucky, and you're working in zones that don't allow you to do mixed use, where you can bring commercial jobs to residential districts, how have you found it working in, I know Pullman has had a lot of attention, and maybe it's a little different, but when we're looking in different neighborhoods, we're finding very little flexibility and no zoning that allows you to really incorporate into a community, which is what dismantled the communities in the first place.
Yeah,
Did everybody hear the question?
we don't, we typically are not involved in neighborhoods where there's a lot of development pressure, and I mean, it sounds like, whether it's Pilsen or other near West Side, near North, where you're in areas where there is development pressure. This is going back to my days working at the city. Aldermen tend to get very scared, and because the change, it's much easier to kind of keep the status quo and not to upset the apple cart. You don't lose votes for not changing things, and so their general kind of default is, I don't want to do something that's going to end up frustrating the neighbor, the people across the street, whatever. So that tends to be their default. So that I understand that in areas where there's a lot of pressure. I don't have an answer to how to overcome that, other than to work with the community, work with the aldermen. On the flip side, there are vast areas of the city where if you were proposing a development, the aldermen, the community groups, the block clubs would welcome you. I mean, we have no problem getting whatever zoning change we want, because they want improvement, they want development, they want activity. And so again, it's this tale of two cities, right? It's, and it happens at so many different levels. And what's, this is where I get a little frustrated with the city is, so they have one planning department. They expect that planning department to do both, regulate development and control development in some areas of the city, and then completely opposite skill set, promote and activate and facilitate development in other parts of the city, all under one department. And my experience is one of those two is going to get more attention, depending on the economic cycle. Right now, the economic cycle is in favor of how do you regulate, how do you maintain, how do you control development. And I would say it's probably to the shortcoming of the other part, which should be promoting and stimulating and facilitating development. Again, that's probably not the politically correct thing to say.
I had a comment and also a question. It was just inspired by the prior dialogue from the other question about, I don't know what the kitty is right now in the affordable housing ordinance pot, but I know it's tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions at this point.
I think it's about 70 million.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I knew, Garfield's development a few years ago, I think that was a $3 million contribution just from one project, so tens of millions. My question is, and maybe this is already being done, but can there not be a match of David Doig's and Pastor Hatch's with those funds and kind of having this pool of resources of folks that know how to activate and connect the resources in the right way to the community? So that's great. Like let the folks that maybe don't know what they're doing or don't want to do it, whatever, and connect those funds with folks like you that understand and have eloquently stated the importance of the wraparound services and everything else that needs to happen in addition to the bricks and mortar. Is that something that's been talked about or that you can make happen?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that's what needs to happen. I think the ARO tool, because it has been more focused on creating affordable units in gentrifying neighborhoods, I think that's where generally the resources have been going. And I'm not disparaging that. It's important. We've got to provide affordable housing in gentrifying areas. It's just the cost to do that is, double. I mean, the cost of the land is going to be more. The cost of the units are going to. It's going to be a lot more expensive, and you're going to have the resources go not as far if you're building affordable units in gentrifying areas as opposed to trying to build middle-income units in areas that need that economic and need those people. In addition to creating more of a tax base in some of these neighborhoods, creating more community, repopulating so that you can support retail. I think the wins on using those resources to do exactly what you suggested are more significant than building in areas where the cost is really, really high.
Yeah, no, and then we found it next to impossible to try to get the waiver from a large developer that was developing on the north side to try to get that affordable housing money spent in West Garfield Park. We would have needed a special waiver for that, and it was just almost next to impossible to get. I mean, it's almost defies logic, because it would have been great to have had that kind of investment with what we already had going in West Garfield Park. But the trying to get that through City Hall was just, it was almost impossible.
I've got to believe that between the folks in this room that we can make it happen somehow. I know
That would be great. That would be great. Yeah, I think one of the, what Reverend Hatch is speaking to is right now, if you're doing a downtown or high market development, residential, and it's rental, it has to be, the replacement units have to be within 2 miles. Well, that doesn't get you to West Garfield, it doesn't get you to Englewood, it doesn't get you to Roseland. I mean, it barely gets you to Western Avenue, right? So that's a limitation in terms of where those replacement units can be built. I think, again, I understand the city's need and desire to kind of create affordability in appreciating areas, but I think it's heavily weighted that way and not enough on the other side.
Well, thank you all so very much, and please keep thinking about this. On to your day.